Hey everyone, I'm Dan from JazzComposersPresent.com, an online space where composers, musicians, and listeners come together to celebrate the music we love. I'm joined today by Annie Booth, award-winning composer, pianist, and bandleader, faculty member at the University of Denver's Lamont School of Music, and co-founder of Brava Jazz Publishing. Annie is here to show us how to use transitional sections to tell the story of a composition.
Hi there, thanks for having me, Jazz Composers Present. So why talk about transitional sections? Transitional sections add cohesion to our compositions. They add clarity to the big picture, and in my opinion, they can turn a good piece into a really great piece. So there's three focuses I want to talk about today with transitions. I want to talk about setting up a landscape for an improviser, using transitions to modulate in key or in meter, and creating cohesion amongst diverse sections of our compositions. So let's start by talking about improvisers and setting up a landscape for them. Jazz improvisation is an essential component of jazz composition, so it makes sense for us to think about it with some intentionality. The head solo head format is tried and true and works fantastic. However, how can we expand on that? Even if we consult historic recordings in small group settings, and of course in large group settings, we find the great innovators have used transitions such as solo send-offs and interludes and solo breaks in their compositions to provide some interest for an improviser before their improvisation starts. I think of A Night in Tunisia as a good example of that, which has an interlude and it has a really fantastic break. Horace Silver as well. Some of the great hard bop composers were really intentional about setting up these landscapes. I also want to offer composers the idea of creating a transitional section that has a little more meat than just a send off or just a solo break. And for this, I want to demonstrate one of my pieces called Jolly Beach, which is a composition for a large jazz ensemble, and in which I wrote a pretty hefty transitional section to set up a piano solo. I elongate phrases here to create some space for the improviser, for the pianist in this case, to improvise around the ensemble figures. And I use some orchestration techniques, including, starting with the full ensemble and then paring it down and then bringing the full ensemble back to create some excitement leading up until a solo break right before the piano solo starts in earnest. So let's have a listen to this transitional section, which comes at the end of a development in my piece, Jolly Beach. So as you can hear, there is a solo break, and I could have just maybe bypassed that whole transitional section and wrote a solo break. But in my opinion, that transitional section offers a little more interest for the piece generally, and certainly for the improviser to kind of have this wind up before their solo begins. So something to think about in our jazz compositions. Next, I want to talk about how transitional sections can help us modulate in key and also in meter. In fact, I think these transitional sections can help make our modulations feel more effortless, almost sneaky. And I love doing this in my writing. One technique I'm going to offer composers to think about with this is the technique of sequencing. So taking a passage and really intentionally moving it, if you're talking about pitch material, moving it in a systematic motion, so maybe by steps, upward or downward, or moving that passage metrically, playing around with the rhythm. So maybe you're augmenting the rhythmic values, or maybe you're shortening the rhythmic values until you get to your destination of the new place. And in this case, I encourage you to maybe think about reverse engineering this. So think about what is the final destination or the new destination that you're hoping the music will go to, the new key or the new meter or the new tempo. and reverse engineer it from there, possibly using the technique of sequencing to get there. This can open up just a lot of freshness in our music. And like I said, you can do it in a very intentional and sneaky way. There's a great time and place for those incredible key changes that move up a whole step in pop music, right? But we can kind of craft some intentional sections to help us get from point A to point B. Lastly, I want to talk about how transitional sections can help us create cohesion in our pieces amongst diverse sections or diverse styles. And to do this, I want to show you a piece of mine called Le Voyage from my 2023 album, Flowers of Evil, a project in which I set the poetry of 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire to music for my 11-piece chamber jazz ensemble. This poetry is very dark and very beautiful, and it kind of lives within that juxtaposition. This poem that is the origin of this piece happens to be very much so on that dark side. I want to show you this transition, which is coming at the end of a guitar solo in kind of a halftime grunge rock feel. It's moving back into the text, which I've set for a vocalist to sing. And then we're moving beyond that into another improvised solo section, which is for trombone. And I'm dealing with these two contrasting styles, this halftime grunge rock feel, which I mentioned, and this kind of melancholic, lilting French waltz feel. So I use some of these transitional ideas of creating space to move between the two styles and make it feel like I'm really setting up the improvised solo that comes at the end in the trombone section. So let's have a listen to Le Voyage. So a couple of things I just want to point out about that section. To get us out of that guitar solo, I wrote this really chromatic, energetic line that the horn players and strings eventually play behind the solo. The guitarist ends up joining in with them to create some cohesion to get us out of that solo section. And once the vocalist is in, something that I use to elongate the phrases and create those transitions between the grunge rock feel and the 3/4 waltz is elongating some of these bars. So there's a 5/4 bar, particularly there in measure 127, that just offers a little bit more breathing room. And that's something when I was composing that, I was just feeling like it was too rushed when it was in 4/4, certainly too rushed when it was in 3/4, maybe too long for 2 bars of 3/4. So that's something I encourage composers to do too, is kind of live with it. A lot of times I'll walk around my composition space here or go on a walk, and I can figure out if a transition needs a little bit more space, maybe an extra bar or maybe a few notes longer. And then similarly, right there when we go into the trombone solo, I extend that phrase in the vocal line to get into the 3/4 and to give us a little bit more space with that dreamy waltz texture. And in the orchestration, I have the ensemble pretty static, pretty inactive there. So that's some strategy for blending two diverse sections together. So I hope this is some food for thought, and I hope that I've offered some ideas for composers to think more intentionally about transitional sections in their pieces, because I think it can just create more character and more cohesion in our works. Thank you so much for being here today, and thanks to Jazz Composers Present for having me.
Thanks for watching today's mini lesson. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Drop any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos down below. To watch our full-length events and participate in live Q&As with our presenting artists, head to jazzcomposerspresent.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.